The autumn fog rolled across Highway 61 like a shroud, thick and suffocating, swallowing the amber glow of streetlights whole. October, the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees by 11:47 p.m., and the asphalt glistened with a treacherous sheen of moisture that made even seasoned drivers grip their steering wheels tighter. In the small town of Millfield, Mississippi, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, the fog brought with it an unnatural silence that settled over the delta like a bad omen. Zeke Thornfield, pulled his 18-wheeler into Rosie's all-night diner, the engine's diesel rumble cutting through the oppressive quiet. At 42, Zeke was a man carved from the highways he'd traveled for the past 20 years. His weathered hands bore the calluses of 1,000 gear shifts, and his deep-set brown eyes held the distant look of someone who'd seen more miles than most people saw years. The lines etched around those eyes told stories of endless nights, of deliveries made through blizzards and heat waves, of a life lived perpetually in motion. Tonight felt different, though. Zeke had been driving the same route from Memphis to New Orleans for 8 years. But as he killed the engine and sat in the cab of his burgundy Peterbilt, something gnawed at him. Call it intuition, call it superstition, but in his 2 decades on the road, Zeke had learned to trust the feeling that crawled up his spine when danger lurked around the next bend. The diner's neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting an eerie pink glow that barely penetrated the fog. Through the condensation-streaked windows, Zeke could make out 3 figures hunched over coffee cups at the counter. Rosie's was one of the last honest truck stops on this stretch of Highway 61, a beacon for long-haul drivers who needed more than just gas and stale sandwiches. Rosie Martinez had been running the place since her husband died in Korea, and she treated every trucker like family. Zeke grabbed his thermos and logbook from the dashboard, checking his watch again. He was making good time despite the weather. His cargo, machine parts bound for a factory in Metairie, wasn't due until Thursday morning, giving him a comfortable cushion. But the fog was getting worse, and even Zeke's 20 years of experience couldn't make the next 100 miles safe in these conditions. The diner's bell chimed as he pushed through the door, bringing with him the smell of diesel fuel and damp October air. The warmth hit him immediately, along with the familiar aroma of coffee that had been brewing since sunrise and hamburgers grilled to perfection. Rosie looked up from behind the counter, her salt and pepper hair pinned back under a faded bandana, her smile genuine despite the late hour. "Zeke Thornfield, you old road dog," she called out, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Thought that was your rig out there. How's the highway treating you tonight?" "Like a jealous woman," Zeke replied, settling onto his usual stool at the far end of the counter. "Beautiful when she wants to be, but ready to kill you if you look at her wrong." Rosie poured his coffee without asking how he liked it. Black as midnight, hot enough to wake the dead. "This fog's got me spooked," she admitted, lowering her voice. "Been coming in and out all week, but tonight it's like something's stirring it up on purpose." The other patrons at the counter were fellow drivers Zeke recognized, but didn't know well. Mickey Valdez, a thin man with nervous hands who ran auto parts up from Houston. Big Jim Crawford, whose massive frame made his stool creak with every movement, hauling lumber from the Arkansas mills. And Tommy Nguyen, barely old enough to have a commercial license, dead tired but trying to hide it behind black coffee and cigarettes. "Any of you boys hear the radio reports?" Big Jim asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emerge from deep in his chest. "Weather Service is calling for this soup to stick around till morning, maybe longer." Mickey's hands twitched around his coffee cup. "I'm thinking about pulling over at the motor lodge up in Clarksdale, waiting it out. This visibility's got me spooked. Can't afford to lose the time," Tommy said, though his voice betrayed his youth and uncertainty. "Got a delivery in Baton Rouge that's already running late." Zeke studied the kid over the rim of his coffee cup. Tommy reminded him of himself 20 years ago, eager, broke, and convinced that every mile lost was money down the drain. "What you hauling, son?" "Electronics," Tommy replied. Televisions and radios, mostly. High-value stuff. Boss made it real clear that being late isn't an option. Something cold settled in Zeke's stomach. High-value cargo on a night like this, through the most isolated stretch of Highway 61. It was like painting a target on your back. The Delta had always been wild country, full of desperate people willing to do desperate things, and the fog provided perfect cover for the kind of trouble that ended up in the newspapers. You might want to reconsider that timeline, Zeke said carefully. Road between here and Vicksburg gets mighty lonely after midnight, especially in weather like this. Tommy's jaw tightened with the stubborn pride of youth. I can handle it. Been driving this route for 6 months now. 6 months. Zeke almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about watching a kid walk into potential disaster. He'd seen too many promising drivers get themselves killed because they confused recklessness with courage. Rosie, Big Jim called out, mind turning up that radio? Want to see if they got any updates on the weather? The radio crackled to life, Johnny Cash's deep voice filling the diner as I Walk the Line played through the static. The song seemed appropriate for the night. A man walking a narrow path, trying to stay true while everything around him tried to pull him off course. When the song ended, the news came on. The announcer's voice was tinged with concern as he described the weather conditions. Dense fog warnings remain in effect for the Mississippi Delta region through Thursday morning. Visibility on major highways has dropped to less than 50 feet in some areas. The Highway Patrol is advising all drivers to exercise extreme caution or consider delaying travel until conditions improve. Extreme caution, Mickey muttered. That's code for you are crazy if you go out there. Zeke finished his coffee and checked his watch again. 12:23 a.m. October 24th now. Something about the date nagged at him, but he couldn't put his finger on what. He'd been through Millfield dozens of times, had countless conversations in this very diner, but tonight everything felt charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. I'm calling it, Big Jim announced, sliding off his stool with surprising grace for such a large man. Got a room at the Motor Lodge. Anyone with sense will do the same. Mickey nodded and followed suit, but Tommy remained seated, staring into his coffee as if the dark liquid might reveal some hidden truth. Zeke could see the internal battle playing out on the kid's face, fear warring with pride, caution wrestling with necessity. Tell you what, son, Zeke said, making a decision that would haunt him forever. I'm heading south too. Why don't you follow my taillights? We can convoy down to Vicksburg, maybe even Louisiana if the fog lifts. Tommy's relief was palpable. You'd do that? I mean, I don't want to slow you down or anything. Safety in numbers, Zeke replied. Besides, I have been running this route since you were in diapers. Know every curve, every hill, every place where trouble likes to hide. Rosie leaned across the counter, her weathered face creased with worry. You boys sure about this? I got a bad feeling about tonight, worse than I have had in years. We will be fine, Zeke assured her, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Just going to take it slow and steady. But as they prepared to leave, something happened that should have been a warning. The radio, which had been playing steadily all evening, suddenly filled with static. The sound grew louder and more aggressive, until it was almost painful to listen to. Then, just as abruptly, it went silent. Power lines must be down somewhere, Rosie said, but her voice carried no conviction. Zeke paid his bill and left a generous tip, as he always did. As he walked toward the door, Rosie caught his arm. Zeke, she said quietly, I have known you for 8 years, and I have never seen you this jumpy. What's got you spooked? He paused, considering how to put his unease into words. You ever get the feeling that everything's about to change? Like you are standing at the edge of a cliff, and one wrong step will send you tumbling into the dark. Every day since my husband died, she replied. But I keep walking anyway, because that's what living folks do. Outside, the fog had grown even thicker, if such a thing were possible. Zeke could barely see his own truck, parked less than 30 feet away. The Peterbilt looked like a ghost ship emerging from gray seas, its chrome bumper catching and reflecting the diner's neon in distorted patterns that hurt to look at. Tommy was already at his rig, a blue Kenworth that had seen better days. The kid was doing a proper pre-trip inspection despite the weather, checking his tires and lights with the kind of thoroughness that gave Zeke hope. Maybe Tommy would make it after all. Maybe they both would. "You ready for this?" Zeke called out, his voice muffled by the thick air. "Ready as I will ever be," Tommy replied, though his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. They fired up their engines almost simultaneously, the twin diesel rumbles creating a symphony that seemed to push back against the oppressive silence of the fog. Zeke clicked on his CB radio and found Channel 19, the trucker's lifeline. "Breaker 19, this is Thornfield Express, northbound out of Rosie's. You got your ears on, Blue Kenworth. That's a big 10-4 Thornfield Express. This is Bayou Runner and I got you 5x5. Bayou Runner." Zeke smiled despite his nervousness. The kid had style, if nothing else. "All right, Bayou Runner, here's how we are going to do this. I'm going to pull out first, and you stay about 100 feet back. You see my taillights disappear. You slow down. You lose me completely. You stop and wait for me to circle back. We are in no hurry tonight. Understand? Copy that, Thornfield Express. 100 feet back. Follow the leader." Zeke pulled out of the diner's parking lot and onto Highway 61, immediately feeling the weight of the fog pressing in around him. His headlights, normally powerful enough to illuminate the road for hundreds of yards, now barely penetrated 20 feet into the gray wall that surrounded them. The yellow center line was his only guide, a faded stripe that seemed to pulse in and out of existence as they crept south at 30 miles per hour. Behind him, Tommy's headlights were a faint glow, barely visible but reassuring in their presence. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant conversations from other drivers, but most of the chatter was from truckers holed up in truck stops and motels, waiting for better weather. "How you doing back there, Bayou Runner?" Zeke asked after they'd been driving for 15 minutes. "Still with you, Thornfield Express." "This fog's thicker than my mama's gravy." The miles crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every curve was a potential disaster, every hill a leap of faith. Zeke found himself leaning forward in his seat, straining to see beyond the reach of his headlights, watching for the reflective markers that lined the highway shoulder. The familiar landmarks that usually marked his progress were invisible, swallowed by the gray void that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. They passed through Totweiler without seeing a single light from the small town. The fog was so thick that they might as well have been driving through outer space. Only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio reminded Zeke that he was still on Earth, still connected to the world of the living. "Thornfield Express, you still up there?" Tommy's voice carried a note of anxiety that hadn't been there before. "Right here, Bayou Runner, just past mile marker 47. How's your fuel?" "Still got plenty, but I'm getting some weird interference on my radio. Sounds like, I don't know, like someone's trying to break in on the channel." Zeke frowned and adjusted his own radio, scanning through the channels. Sure enough, there was something there. A low, rhythmic sound that might have been voices or might have been static. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, growing stronger and then fading, like a distant heartbeat. "Probably just atmospheric interference," Zeke said, though he didn't believe it himself. The fog can play tricks with radio signals, but as they continued south, the interference grew stronger. By the time they reached Clarksdale, it was almost overwhelming, drowning out even their own transmissions. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the silence that followed was somehow worse than the static had been. "Bayou Runner, you copy?" "Nothing." "Bayou Runner, come back." Still nothing. Zeke checked his mirrors, but the fog was too thick to see anything. He began to slow down, preparing to pull over and wait for Tommy to catch up, when his CB radio suddenly crackled to life. "Thornfield Express, this is Bayou Runner. Sorry about that." Radio went dead for a minute there. Relief flooded through Zeke's chest. "No problem, son. Thought I'd lost you for good. Not yet. Though I got to tell you, I'm seeing some strange things in this fog." "What kind of strange things?" There was a long pause before Tommy answered. "Lights, moving through the fog like they are floating, and sounds, like voices calling from way off in the distance." Zeke felt the familiar chill crawl up his spine. He'd heard stories from other drivers about strange phenomena on lonely highways, especially in the Delta. Most of it was just road fatigue and overactive imaginations. But on a night like this, the line between reality and nightmare became dangerously thin. "Just keep your eyes on my taillights," Zeke advised. "The fog can make you see things that aren't there." They pressed on through the suffocating gray world, past invisible towns and phantom landmarks. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon leading into oblivion, marked only by the faded yellow line and the occasional reflective marker that flashed briefly in their headlights before disappearing again. At 2:17 a.m., they reached the outskirts of Vicksburg. Zeke knew they were close to the city because the fog began to thin slightly, revealing the ghostly outlines of billboards and power lines. The relief was palpable. They'd made it through the worst of it. "How you feeling back there, Bayou Runner?" Zeke asked. "Like I just aged 10 years, Tommy replied. "But I'm still here. Thanks for the escort, Thornfield Express. Don't think I could have made it on my own. Glad to help. You want to stop here for the night? Or you feel up to pushing on to Louisiana?" There was a long pause before Tommy answered. "Actually, I think I'm going to keep going. The fog's lifting, and I'm making better time than I expected. Might even get to Baton Rouge early." Something in the kid's voice had changed. The nervousness was gone, replaced by an odd confidence that didn't fit the situation. Zeke couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what. "You sure about that? Still pretty thick out there." "I'm sure, but thanks again for the help. I owe you one." "No problem. You drive safe now, you hear? Always do. Bayou Runner, clear and gone." Zeke watched Tommy's taillights disappear into the fog as the younger driver pulled ahead. Within seconds, the blue Kenworth was swallowed by the gray wall, leaving Zeke alone on the highway. He considered following, but his load wasn't due until Thursday, and he was exhausted from the stress of driving blind for over 2 hours. He pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of Vicksburg, parked his rig, and climbed into the sleeper berth. As he lay there listening to the fog roll across the metal roof of his cab, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made a terrible mistake. Something about Tommy's final transmission bothered him, though he couldn't say exactly what. It was the last time anyone would hear from either of them. When Zeke failed to check in with his dispatcher the next morning, and when Tommy's Kenworth was found abandoned on Highway 61 south of Vicksburg with its cargo missing and no sign of the driver, the Mississippi Highway Patrol launched an investigation that would consume resources for months and yield no answers. Zeke's Peterbilt was never found. Not so much as a piece of chrome or a skid mark to indicate what had happened to him. It was as if the highway had simply opened up and swallowed him whole. The fog lifted on October 25th, revealing a clear autumn day that mocked the horrors of the night before. But by then, 2 trucks and 2 men had vanished into the gray void, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that Highway 61 held secrets darker than anyone had imagined. In the weeks that followed, other drivers began reporting strange phenomena on that stretch of road. Voices on the CB radio, calling for help. Phantom headlights that followed them through the fog. The sound of 18-wheelers in the distance, their engines laboring as if pulling enormous loads, though no trucks could be seen. Rosie Martinez closed her diner 3 months later. She told anyone who asked that she couldn't stand the thought of sending another driver out into that fog, couldn't bear the weight of watching good men disappear into the dark. But those who knew her best understood the truth. She'd seen something that night, something that had shaken her faith in the ordered world she'd always believed in. The official investigation concluded that Zeke Thornfield had likely suffered a medical emergency while driving, causing his truck to leave the roadway and plunge into one of the many waterways that crisscrossed the delta. Tommy Whelan's case was classified as a robbery gone wrong, his cargo stolen and his body disposed of by unknown assailants. But the investigators knew, even as they filed their reports, that these explanations didn't fit the facts. There were no skid marks, no broken guardrails, no evidence of violence. It was as if both men had simply decided to drive off the edge of the world. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the space between the official record and the whispered stories that truck drivers told each other in the safety of well-lit diners. Highway 61 had always been a road of legends, the blues highway that carried music and misery in equal measure from the delta to the world beyond. But now it carried something else, something that waited in the fog for unwary travelers who ventured too far from the light. And in the deepest hours of the night, when the fog rolled in thick and suffocating, some drivers swore they could still hear Zeke Thornfield's voice on Channel 19, calling out into the static for a blue Kenworth that would never answer back, a guardian angel warning others away from the trap that had claimed him. Or perhaps something else entirely, something that used his voice to lure new victims into the gray void where time stopped and trucks disappeared without a trace. The road that had swallowed 2 trucks in 1959 was hungry for more, and it would wait patiently in the fog for its next meal. Detective Ray Blackwood had seen enough mysteries in his 15 years with the Mississippi Highway Patrol to know when he was dealing with something that defied logical explanation. The morning of October 25th, 1959, should have brought answers. Instead, it brought only more questions that seemed to multiply like shadows at sunset. The fog had lifted completely by 7 a.m., revealing a crystalline autumn day that mocked the horrors of the previous night. Blackwood stood beside Tommy Nguyen's abandoned Kenworth on the shoulder of Highway 61, approximately 12 miles south of Vicksburg, watching the crime scene photographers document what might have been the most perplexing case of his career. The blue truck sat perfectly positioned on the gravel shoulder, its engine cold but showing no signs of mechanical failure. The driver's door hung open like a mouth frozen mid-scream, and Tommy's logbook lay scattered across the asphalt, its pages fluttering in the morning breeze like wounded birds. But the cargo bay told the real story, or rather the absence of one. "Cleaned out," reported Sergeant Dale Hoffman, a stocky man whose methodical nature had solved more cases than intuition ever could. Every last television and radio gone. Must have been a hell of an operation to move that much merchandise in the fog. Blackwood crouched beside the truck's rear bumper, examining the ground for tire tracks that might indicate where the thieves had taken their haul. But the gravel showed no clear impressions, and the fog had left everything damp enough to obscure most evidence. What bothered him more than the missing cargo was what hadn't been taken. "Dale, come look at this," he called, pointing to the cab's interior. "Wallets still in the glove compartment. $300 cash, driver's license, everything intact. Wedding ring still on the seat where he left it." Hoffman joined him, peering through the open door. "What kind of thieves leave cash behind?" "The kind that aren't really thieves," Blackwood muttered, though he wasn't sure what he meant by that. Something about the scene felt staged, like a movie set dressed to look like a crime but missing the essential details that made it believable. The radio crackled with an update from the search teams. They'd been combing the ditches and waterways for any sign of Zeke Thornfield's burgundy Peterbilt since dawn, but so far had found nothing, not a tire track, not a piece of debris, not even a skid mark to suggest where the truck might have left the highway. "Detective Blackwood," came the voice of Deputy Frank Morrison, "we have got something you need to see. About 2 miles north of the Bryan truck." Blackwood and Hoffman exchanged glances. Morrison was a veteran deputy who didn't get excited easily. If he'd found something worth reporting, it was significant. They drove north along Highway 61, past the section of road where witnesses claim to have last seen both trucks. The highway stretched through typical Delta country, flat farmland, broken by patches of swamp, and the occasional cluster of sharecropper houses, nothing that could swallow an 18-wheeler without a trace. Morrison was waiting beside his patrol car at mile marker 52, his usually stoic expression replaced by something that might have been fear. In his 23 years of law enforcement, Blackwood had never seen the deputy look unsettled. "What you got, Frank?" Morrison pointed toward a section of highway that looked identical to every other stretch they'd passed. "Found this about an hour ago. Thought you should see it before we let anyone else know." He led them to a spot roughly 30 feet from the highway's edge, where the grass showed clear signs of disturbance. But it wasn't the flattened vegetation that caught Blackwood's attention. It was the pattern it formed. The grass was pressed down in two parallel lines, each about 8 feet wide and stretching for approximately 60 feet before disappearing into a stand of cypress trees. "Looks like tire tracks," Hoffman observed, "but they are too wide for a regular truck." Blackwood knelt beside one of the impressions, running his fingers along the compressed earth. The tracks were indeed too wide for any vehicle he'd ever seen, and they seemed to sink deeper into the ground than physics should have allowed. More disturbing was the fact that they appeared to lead directly into the swamp, where no vehicle could possibly travel. "Frank, how far do these go?" "That's the thing," Morrison replied, his voice tight with suppressed anxiety. "They don't go anywhere. Just stop about 10 feet into the trees, like whatever made them just vanished." Blackwood followed the tracks into the cypress grove, noting how the morning sunlight seemed to dim as he moved deeper into the trees. The air grew cooler and carried an odd metallic taste that reminded him of blood. The tracks continued for exactly 9 feet and 4 inches before ending abruptly at the edge of a small clearing. The clearing itself was wrong in ways that Blackwood couldn't articulate. The grass grew in perfect circles, as if something had burned precise patterns into the earth. The trees around the perimeter were twisted into unnatural shapes, their branches reaching toward the center like gnarled fingers, and in the very middle of the clearing sat something that made no sense at all. A chrome bumper, obviously from a large truck, lay partially buried in the soft earth. But it wasn't the bumper itself that chilled Blackwood's blood. It was the fact that it seemed to be sinking into the ground even as he watched, disappearing inch by inch like something was pulling it down from below. "Jesus Christ," Hoffman whispered, having followed them into the clearing. "What the hell is this place?" Before Blackwood could answer, his radio crackled to life with an urgent transmission from headquarters. "All units, we have got a situation at Rosie's Diner. Multiple witnesses reporting strange activity. Detective Blackwood, you are needed on scene immediately." The drive back to Millfield took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Blackwood's mind raced as he tried to process what he'd seen in the clearing. The chrome bumper could have come from Zeke's Peterbilt, but how had it ended up buried in the middle of a swamp? And what force could create those impossible tire tracks that led nowhere? Rosie's Diner was surrounded by patrol cars when they arrived. A crowd of truckers and local residents had gathered in the parking lot, their faces pale with the particular kind of fear that comes from witnessing something that shouldn't exist. Rosie Martinez stood near the diner's entrance, clutching a coffee cup with hands that shook despite the morning warmth. "Detective," she called out as Blackwood approached. "Thank God you are here. It's been going on since sunrise." "What's been going on?" Rosie's voice dropped to a whisper. "The radio. The one that went dead when Zeke and Tommy left last night. It came back on around 6 this morning, and it's been playing the same thing over and over again." Blackwood could hear it as soon as he stepped inside the diner, a low, distorted voice emerging from the old radio behind the counter. The signal was weak and filled with static, but the words were unmistakable. "Breaker 19, this is Thornfield Express, northbound out of Rosie's. You got your ears on, Blue Kenworth?" The transmission repeated every 30 seconds, exactly as it had been spoken the night before. But there was something wrong with the voice. an odd echo that suggested it was coming from very far away, or perhaps from somewhere that distance couldn't properly measure. "How long has this been going on?" Blackwood asked. "4 hours now," replied Big Jim Crawford, who'd been among the truckers waiting out the fog. Same message over and over. But that's not the strangest part. He gestured toward the radio with a shaking hand. "We tried tuning to other stations. Hell, we even unplugged the damn thing, but it keeps playing. And the voice, it's getting clearer." As if summoned by his words, the radio crackled again. This time, Zeke's voice came through with crystalline clarity, as if he was standing in the room with them. "Breaker 19, this is Thornfield Express. Can anybody hear me? I'm lost in the fog, and something's following me. Something that ain't right." The blood drained from Blackwood's face. This wasn't the transmission from the night before. This was something new. Something that suggested Zeke Thornfield might still be alive, trapped somewhere in a gray void that existed between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. "Jesus," Hoffman whispered. "How is this possible?" Before anyone could answer, the radio erupted with a new voice, younger, more frightened. Tommy Nguyen's voice cut through the static like a knife. "Thornfield Express. This is Bayou Runner. I can see your taillights, but they are getting farther away. The fog's moving, man. It's moving like it's alive. And there are things in it. Things that look like people, but they ain't people. They are trying to get in my cab." The transmission dissolved into static mixed with what sounded like screaming. Then silence. The diner remained quiet for a full minute, everyone staring at the radio as if it might suddenly provide answers to questions they were afraid to ask. When the silence was finally broken, it was by Rosie's shaking voice. "Detective, I need to tell you something about last night. Something I didn't mention before." Blackwood turned his full attention to her, noting the way her hands trembled as she set down her coffee cup. "What is it, Rosie?" "After Zeke and Tommy left, I started cleaning up, getting ready to close. But around 1 in the morning, someone came in. A man I'd never seen before, wearing a suit that looked expensive but old-fashioned, like something from the 20s or 30s. She paused, gathering her courage. He didn't say much, just ordered coffee and sat at the counter. But his eyes, God, his eyes were like looking into a deep well. And when he spoke, his voice had the same echo that's coming from the radio now. What did he say? He asked about the 2 drivers who'd just left, wanted to know what they were hauling, where they were headed. I told him it wasn't any of his business, but he just smiled. And when he smiled, I swear I could see all the way through him, like he was made of fog himself. Blackwood felt the familiar chill crawl up his spine. What happened then? He finished his coffee and left a silver dollar for payment. But when I went to pick it up after he was gone, it wasn't there anymore, just a wet spot on the counter, like the fog had condensed and then evaporated. The radio suddenly burst to life again, but this time it wasn't Zeke or Tommy's voice. It was something else entirely, a deep, resonant sound that might have been laughter or might have been the wind, howling through empty spaces. "The road takes what the road wants," the voice said, each word dripping with malevolent amusement. "Some debts can only be paid in blood and steel." Then static and silence. Blackwood's investigation took a dramatic turn when he discovered that Tommy Nguyen and Zeke Thornfield weren't the first to disappear on Highway 6. A trip to the state archives revealed a pattern of vanishings that stretched back decades, always occurring during episodes of supernatural fog, always involving drivers who had valuable cargo. The first recorded incident dated to 1923. When a bootlegger named Vincent Torelli vanished between Clarksdale and Vicksburg, his truck loaded with premium whiskey that never reached its destination. The report, filed by a young deputy whose handwriting had faded to barely legible scratches, described finding the vehicle abandoned with its cargo missing and strange tire tracks leading into the swamp. Every 7 to 10 years, the pattern repeated. A driver would disappear in the fog, leaving behind only an abandoned vehicle and traces of something that defied explanation. The missing men were always hauling high-value cargo: alcohol during Prohibition, electronics in the post-war boom, machinery during the industrial expansion of the 50s. But it was the testimony of surviving witnesses that truly chilled Blackwood's blood. In 1934, a driver named Arthur Pope claimed to have seen a ghostly figure standing on the highway during a fog-shrouded night. The figure, he said, had flagged him down and asked what he was carrying. When Pope refused to stop, the fog began to follow his truck, growing thicker and more oppressive until he could barely see his own headlights. It was like the fog was alive, Pope had told investigators. Like it was hungry for something, and it wouldn't let me go until it got what it wanted. Pope had escaped by abandoning his truck and hiding in a roadside ditch until dawn. When he returned with help, they found his vehicle exactly where he'd left it, but the cargo of farm equipment was gone without a trace. Similar stories emerged from the files: drivers who spoke of phantom hitchhikers, mysterious figures in old-fashioned clothing, and fog that moved with purpose and intelligence. Most had been dismissed as the products of stressed minds and sleep deprivation, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Blackwood's breakthrough came when he discovered the land records for the area where Tommy's truck had been found. The property had changed hands repeatedly over the decades, but always under suspicious circumstances. Previous owners had a habit of disappearing, leaving behind only deaths and strange stories told by their neighbors. The current owner was listed as Cornelius Ashworth, a name that appeared nowhere else in local records. The address given was a post office box in New Orleans that, when Blackwood called to check, had been closed for 15 years. But it was the historical records that provided the most disturbing information. In 1897, a railroad accident had occurred near the same spot where Tommy's truck was found. A freight train carrying industrial machinery had derailed during a freak fog, killing the engineer and conductor. The wreckage had never been fully recovered, and local residents reported strange phenomena in the area for years afterward. Trains that ran in the night with no headlight, one witness had written. The sound of wheels on tracks where no tracks existed, and fog that came up from nowhere, thick as cotton and twice as white. The connection was becoming clear, though Blackwood hesitated to put his growing theory into his official reports. Highway 61 followed the same route as the old railroad line. The accidents, the disappearances, the supernatural phenomena, they were all connected to something that had been awakened by that train crash more than 60 years ago. His investigation led him to Eulalia Thibodeau, an elderly woman who lived in a shotgun house on the outskirts of Millfield. At 87, Eulalia was one of the few people still alive who remembered the railroad accident. She was also rumored to be a practitioner of the old ways, what some called voodoo and others called folk magic. "You come about the fog men," she said when Blackwood knocked on her door, as if she'd been expecting him. "Took you long enough to find your way here." Eulalia's house was filled with the scents of dried herbs and burning candles. Shadows danced on the walls despite the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate a world that existed somewhere between the physical and the spiritual. "Tell me about the train," Blackwood said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered despite his better judgment. "Wasn't just any train," Eulalia replied, settling into a rocking chair that creaked with age. "Was carrying something it shouldn't have been carrying. Something that belonged to my people, stolen from a sacred place down in the bayou." She rocked slowly, her dark eyes fixed on something only she could see. The spirits followed that train, trying to get back what was taken. When it crashed, they were trapped between worlds, not alive, not dead, just hungry. Hungry for the debts that needed paying. What kind of debts? Blood debts, life debts. The kind that can only be settled by taking from those who have too much. Her eyes focused on Blackwood with startling intensity. That train was carrying more than machinery. Detective, it was carrying the stolen bones of my ancestors, taken from their burial ground to be sold to some museum up north. The revelation hit Blackwood like a physical blow. The cargo thefts weren't random acts of crime. They were attempts by trapped spirits to reclaim what had been stolen from them decades ago. But why had the pattern changed? Why were they now taking trucks instead of trains? Because the world changed, Eulalia said, as if reading his thoughts. Trains stopped running that route, but the spirits remained. They learned to adapt, to take what they needed from whatever passed through their territory. And the drivers? Eulalia's expression grew dark. The drivers are the price. The spirits need energy to exist in our world. Life force is the strongest energy there is. They take the cargo to satisfy their hunger for justice, and they take the drivers to satisfy their hunger for existence. Can they be stopped? Everything can be stopped, detective, but some prices are higher than others. As Blackwood prepared to leave, Eulalia caught his arm with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone her age. You planning to go back out there, aren't you? Back to where the fog comes thickest. I have to. There are still 2 men missing. 1 man, she corrected. The young one, Tommy, he's gone. Fed to the fog 3 nights ago. But the older one, Zeke, he's still fighting. Still trying to find his way home. How do you know? Because the radio's still playing his voice. As long as he's calling out, there's still hope, but not much time. She pressed something into his hand, a small cloth bag that smelled of strange herbs and old secrets. When you find him, you are going to need this more than you need your gun. Blackwood looked down at the bag, feeling an odd warmth emanating from its contents. What is it? Protection, Eulalia said simply. And maybe, if you are very lucky, a way to set things right. That night, as Blackwood prepared for what he knew would be his most dangerous investigation, the radio at Rosie's diner began broadcasting again. But this time, it wasn't Zeke's voice calling out into the static. It was something else entirely, a deep, resonant chanting in a language that predated English by centuries. And somewhere in the fog that was beginning to roll across Highway 61, something ancient and hungry was preparing to collect another debt. October 30th, 1959. 6 days since Zeke Thornfield and Tommy Whelan had vanished into the fog, and Detective Ray Blackwood knew he was running out of time. The radio transmissions from Rosie's diner had grown weaker each night, Zeke's voice fading like a dying battery. If Eulalia Thibodeau was right, if Zeke was still alive somewhere in that gray void between worlds, then tonight might be his last chance. Blackwood sat in his patrol car at the edge of Highway 61, watching the familiar wall of fog begin to roll across the delta. It came with the same unnatural purpose he'd witnessed 6 nights ago, moving against the wind, defying the laws of nature as it consumed everything in its path. But this time, he was ready. The cloth bag Eulalia had given him rested on the passenger seat, along with a leather journal filled with her handwritten instructions. The old woman had spent the past 3 days teaching him things that weren't covered in police academy training. How to recognize spiritual manifestation, how to protect himself from entities that existed outside normal reality, and most importantly, how to navigate the space between the living world and whatever realm had claimed Zeke Thornfield. Remember, Eulalia had told him that afternoon, her weathered hands gripping his shoulders with surprising strength. The spirits aren't evil. They are trapped, hungry, desperate. They have been waiting more than 60 years for justice. And that kind of pain can drive even the purest soul to darkness. So how do I reason with them? You don't reason with them, detective. You give them what they want. Now, as the fog began to thicken around his patrol car, Blackwood understood what she meant. He reached into the back seat and pulled out a wooden crate he'd retrieved from the New Orleans Museum of Natural History that morning. Inside, wrapped in faded burial cloth, were the bones of 3 Native American ancestors, stolen from their sacred burial ground in 1897 and loaded onto the train that had crashed near this very spot. The museum curator had been reluctant to release them, citing legal procedures and academic protocols. But when Blackwood explained that these remains were connected to an active investigation involving multiple disappearances, the man's bureaucratic resistance had crumbled. Sometimes the badge opened doors that reason couldn't. The fog had grown thick enough now that Blackwood could barely see beyond his headlights. He started the engine and pulled onto Highway 61, following the same route Zeke and Tommy had taken 6 nights ago. But instead of heading south toward Vicksburg, he turned north at mile marker 52, toward the mysterious clearing where he'd found the sinking chrome bumper. The drive through the fog was like navigating through a living nightmare. Shapes moved just beyond the reach of his headlights. Tall figures that might have been trees or might have been something else entirely. The radio crackled with static that occasionally resolved into whispered voices speaking in languages he didn't recognize. And always permeating everything was the sense of being watched by invisible eyes that measured his every move. When he reached the clearing, Blackwood parked his car and gathered his equipment. Along with the crate of bones, he carried a powerful flashlight, his service revolver, though he doubted bullets would be effective against what he expected to encounter, and Eulalia's protective charm bag. The old woman had also given him a piece of chalk blessed with prayers from 3 different spiritual traditions, which he was supposed to use to draw a circle of protection if things went badly. The clearing looked different at night, more alive somehow. The twisted trees seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and the strange circular patterns in the grass glowed with a faint phosphorescence that hurt to look at directly. But it was the center of the clearing that captured Blackwood's attention. Where the chrome bumper had been sinking into the earth 6 days ago, there was now a hole. Not a normal hole, but a perfectly circular opening that seemed to descend infinitely into darkness. Cold air rose from its depths, carrying scents of metal and motor oil mixed with something older and more primal, the smell of bone dust and ancient grief. As Blackwood approached the edge, his flashlight beam disappeared into the void without revealing bottom or sides. This was no natural sinkhole. This was a doorway, a passage between the world of the living and the realm where vengeful spirits collected their debts in blood and steel. "Zeke," he called into the darkness. "Zeke Thornfield, can you hear me?" His voice echoed strangely, as if the hole were much larger than it appeared. For a moment there was only silence. Then, faint but unmistakable, came a response. "Who's that? Who's calling me?" The voice was weak, exhausted, but it was definitely Zeke. Blackwood felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. The man was alive, but where was he? And how could Blackwood reach him? "This is Detective Blackwood, Mississippi Highway Patrol. I'm here to get you out." A bitter laugh drifted up from the depths. "Ain't no getting out of here, Detective. Been trying for 6 days now. This place, it ain't part of the world anymore. It's somewhere else, somewhere in between. Tell me what you see, Zeke. Describe your surroundings." There was a long pause before Zeke answered. "It's like being inside a cloud, but the cloud's made of metal and memories. I can see my truck, but it's not really my truck. It's every truck that ever disappeared on this road, all existing at the same time. And there are others here, drivers from years past. Decades past. Some of them don't even remember their own names anymore." Blackwood felt the blood chill in his veins. "What about Tommy?" Tommy? Zeke's voice carried infinite sadness. "Tommy's gone, Detective. They took him 3 days ago, fed him to the fog to keep themselves strong. I tried to save him, but I wasn't fast enough. Wasn't strong enough. Who took him? Who are they? The ones who were wronged, the ones whose bones were stolen and sold like carnival curiosities. They have been trapped here since the train crashed, getting hungrier and angrier with each passing year. They take our cargo because it reminds them of what was stolen from them, and they take us because they need our life force to exist." Blackwood looked down at the crate of bones beside him. According to Eulalia, returning the remains to their proper resting place might appease the spirits and close the doorway between worlds. But first, he had to get Zeke out of that nightmare realm. "Zeke, I need you to listen carefully. I have something here that might help." But I need to know, can you move around down there? Can you find your way to where my voice is coming from? I can try. But detective, you need to understand. They know you are here. They have been waiting for someone like you. Someone with authority. Someone they can use to expand their reach. If you come down here, you might not make it back out. That's a chance I will have to take. Blackwood secured a rope to his patrol car and lowered it into the hole. The rope disappeared into the darkness just like his flashlight beam, giving no indication of how deep the void actually was. But as he prepared to climb down, something emerged from the fog behind him. Detective Blackwood. He spun around to see a figure approaching through the mist, a tall man in an expensive but old-fashioned suit, just as Rosie had described. The figure's face was partially obscured by shadow, but his eyes glowed with an inner light that seemed to come from very far away. "You have something that belongs to us," the figure said, his voice carrying the same ethereal echo as the radio transmissions. "I have something that belongs to them," Blackwood corrected, gesturing toward the hole. "The bones of your people stolen more than 60 years ago." The figure paused, and for a moment Blackwood thought he saw surprise flicker across those otherworldly features. I know enough. I know you have been trapped here since the train crash, taking cargo and drivers to sustain yourselves. I know you are not evil, just desperate for justice that was denied to you in life." Justice. The word seemed to echo from multiple throats, as if spoken by a chorus of the dead. "Do you understand what was taken from us, detective? Not just our bones, but our connection to the spirit world, our ability to find peace in death. We were violated in the most fundamental way possible." More figures began to emerge from the fog, men and women in various states of ethereal decay, their clothing spanning decades of fashion. Blackwood recognized some faces from missing person files dating back to the 1920s. Vincent Torelli, the bootlegger who'd vanished in Arthur Pope, who'd escaped but returned years later, drawn back to the road that had claimed so many others. Dozens of drivers who'd made the mistake of carrying valuable cargo through this cursed stretch of highway. "We understand your pain," Blackwood said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the supernatural assembly surrounding him. "But taking innocent lives won't bring you peace. It only adds to the injustice." The lead figure, who Blackwood now realized must be one of the original train crew from 1897, stepped closer. "Innocent. These men profit from the same system that stole our ancestors' remains and sold them to the highest bidder. They are part of the machine that grinds up the sacred and spits out profit. Zeke Thornfield is a truck driver trying to make an honest living. He's not responsible for what happened to you. He carries cargo. Cargo is theft. Theft must be punished." The logic was circular, driven by decades of pain and fury rather than reason. Blackwood realized that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed to show them a different path. He knelt beside the crate and carefully removed the first set of remains. The bones were brown with age, wrapped in rotting burial cloth that fell apart at his touch. As soon as the remains were exposed to the air, the atmosphere in the clearing changed. The fog began to swirl more rapidly, and the assembled spirits grew more agitated. "These are the bones of your people," Blackwood said, raising his voice above a wind that had suddenly picked up. "Stolen from their sacred burial ground and put on display like trophies. I'm returning them to you so they can be properly honored." The lead spirit's expression softened slightly, but his companions remained hostile. "Words are easy. Detective, actions matter. If you truly wish to make amends, you must take the place of those we have claimed. You must join us in our vigil." "That's not justice," Blackwood replied. "That's revenge. And revenge only creates more victims." From deep in the hole came Zeke's voice, stronger now and filled with determination. "Detective, don't listen to them. I can see what they really are now. They are not the wronged spirits they claim to be. They are something else, something that feeds on guilt and anger. The real spirits, the ones whose bones were stolen. They moved on long ago. These things just wear their faces. The assembled figures hissed in unison, their ethereal forms beginning to shift and distort. The illusion of humanity fell away, revealing creatures of fog and shadow that bore only passing resemblance to the men and women they'd appeared to be. Clever, the lead entity snarled, its voice now layered with inhuman harmonics. But not clever enough. We have fed on the guilt of the living for decades, growing stronger with each life we consume. Soon we will be strong enough to expand beyond this small stretch of road, to claim entire highways as our hunting grounds. Blackwood understood now why Eulalia had given him the protective charm. These weren't trapped spirits seeking justice. They were parasitic entities that had taken advantage of a genuine tragedy to establish a foothold in the world of the living. The real spirits of the train accident victims had probably found peace decades ago, but these creatures had used their memory as camouflage for their predatory activities. "You are not getting any stronger," Blackwood said, reaching into his pocket for the chalk Eulalia had given him. "Because I'm closing your door." He began drawing a circle around the hole, speaking the words of protection the old woman had taught him. The entities rushed forward, but the chalk line flared with brilliant white light that stopped them cold. Their shrieks of rage and frustration filled the clearing, but they could not cross the barrier. "Zeke," Blackwood called into the hole, "can you climb?" "I can try. But detective, they are going crazy down here. The whole place is shaking apart." The rope went taut as Zeke began his ascent. But the entities weren't finished. Unable to cross the protective circle, they began attacking the trees around the clearing, using their supernatural strength to uproot massive cypresses and hurl them toward Blackwood's position. One trunk crashed down just inches from the chalk circle, its impact sending tremors through the ground. Another struck the side of Blackwood's patrol car, crushing the roof and shattering every window. But the circle held, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Zeke Thornfield emerged from the hole. The man who climbed out bore little resemblance to the confident trucker who'd entered Rosie's diner 6 nights ago. Zeke was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his clothes torn, and his hair gone completely white. But he was alive, and his eyes still held the spark of sanity. "The bones," Zeke gasped, collapsing to his knees within the protective circle. "You have to get them to their proper resting place. It's the only way to close the door permanently." Blackwood looked down at the crate, then at the swirling mass of entities that surrounded them. According to Eulalia's instructions, he needed to take the remains to the original burial ground, 20 miles south near the Mississippi River. But how could they escape the clearing with hostile spirits blocking every exit? The answer came from an unexpected source. As Blackwood knelt beside the bones, trying to figure out their next move, he heard a new voice calling from beyond the fog, an elderly woman's voice, strong and clear despite the supernatural chaos. "Cornelius, Vincent, Arthur, all you lost souls, hear me now." Eulalia Thibodeau emerged from the mist, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. She carried a staff carved with symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light, and her voice carried an authority that made even the entities pause their assault. "You have forgotten who you truly are," she continued, addressing the creatures directly. "You were once good men who died in service to others. The hunger has twisted you, made you forget your humanity, but it is not too late to remember." The lead entity snarled at her approach. "Old woman, your power is nothing compared to ours. We have fed well on the guilt and fear of the living." "Have you?" Eulalia asked, raising her staff. "Then why are you still trapped in this small corner of the world? Why haven't you been able to expand your influence beyond a few miles of highway? I will tell you why. Because deep down you know what you are doing is wrong. The guilt you have been feeding on, it's your own." The entities recoiled as if struck. For the first time since they'd appeared, uncertainty flickered across their twisted features. "The bones belong to my ancestors," Eulalia continued, stepping carefully around the protective circle. and I am here to take them home. But I offer you a choice. Let go of the anger that binds you to this place. Accept the forgiveness you have been denying yourselves, and find the peace that has been waiting for you for more than 60 years. We cannot, the lead entity whispered, its voice now filled with pain rather than rage. We have done too much harm, taken too many lives. Redemption is always possible, Eulalia replied gently, but only if you choose it. The entities looked at each other, then at the hole that had been their prison and their power source. One by one, they began to nod. The fog around the clearing started to thin, and the unnatural cold that had permeated the air began to dissipate. We choose peace, the lead entity said, and as it spoke, its twisted features began to resolve into the face of a tired man who had been carrying too much guilt for too long. We choose to remember who we were before the hunger consumed us. The hole in the center of the clearing began to close, sealing itself as if it had never existed. The phosphorescent patterns in the grass faded, and the twisted trees straightened themselves into natural shapes. As the entities accepted forgiveness from themselves as much as from their victims, they began to fade, finally finding the rest that had been denied to them for decades. Thank you, Zeke whispered as the last of the spirits disappeared. They showed me things down there, the guilt they carried, the pain of being trapped between worlds. I almost felt sorry for them. Compassion is not weakness, Eulalia said, helping him to his feet. It is the strongest force in any world. 3 hours later, as dawn broke over the Mississippi Delta, Detective Ray Blackwood stood beside a freshly dug grave in a small cemetery that few people knew existed. The bones of the 3 ancestors had been returned to sacred ground, blessed according to traditions that predated European settlement by centuries, and laid to rest with the dignity they deserved. Zeke Thornfield sat on a nearby tombstone, still weak but recovering his strength with each passing hour. The supernatural ordeal had aged him, but it had also given him a perspective on life that few people ever achieved. He would never drive long haul again, but he would find other ways to serve others, other ways to honor the second chance he'd been given. What about the official report? Blackwood asked Eulalia as they prepared to leave the cemetery. The truth, she replied simply. Maybe not all of it, but enough. People need to know that some mysteries can't be solved with conventional methods, that sometimes justice requires more than law enforcement. And highways will be safe now. The door is closed, the spirits are at rest, and the living can pass through without fear. She paused, looking back at the graves. But there are other roads, Detective. Other places where the past refuses to stay buried. Other mysteries that will need someone like you to solve them. Blackwood nodded, understanding that his career had just taken a turn he never could have anticipated. But as he helped Zeke into his patrol car and prepared for the drive back to Millfield, he felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with closing case files. The radio crackled to life as they pulled onto the highway, but this time it carried only normal traffic, weather reports, music, and the comfortable chatter of truck drivers who would never know how close they'd come to joining the ranks of the disappeared. Raker 19, came a familiar voice through the static. It was Zeke, using Blackwood's radio to check in with the world he'd thought he'd lost forever. This is Thornfield Express, eastbound for home. Roads clear, weather's fine, and it's good to be alive. The response came from drivers all up and down Highway 61, welcoming back a voice they'd feared was lost forever. And as the sun climbed higher over the delta, burning away the last traces of supernatural fog, Detective Ray Blackwood knew that some stories had endings worth fighting for. In the official report, filed 3 weeks later, the disappearance of Ezekiel Thornfield was attributed to a medical emergency that caused temporary amnesia. Thomas Mearn was listed as a victim of robbery-homicide. His body never recovered. The cargo thefts were blamed on an organized crime ring that had since been disrupted by law enforcement action. But in the real world, where truth was more complex than paperwork could capture, the story of Highway 61 became legend. Truck drivers still told tales of that foggy October night when two good men drove into the unknown, and only one came back. They spoke of the courage it took to face the darkness that lived between worlds, and the wisdom required to choose forgiveness over revenge. And sometimes, on particularly clear nights when the stars shone bright over the Mississippi Delta, travelers along Highway 61 reported hearing faint voices on their CB radios, not the tortured transmissions of the trapped and hungry, but the peaceful conversations of spirits who had finally found their way home. The road that had once swallowed trucks and men whole had become something different, a passage not just between cities, but between the world of the living and the realm of the redeemed. And Detective Ray Blackwood, who had learned that some cases required more than badges and handcuffs to solve, continued his work with the knowledge that justice, like truth, sometimes took forms that could never be captured in official reports. The mystery of Highway 61 was closed, but the legends it spawned would live forever, reminding all who heard them that redemption was always possible, and that the most important battles were fought not against flesh and blood, but against the darkness that lived in the spaces between worlds.